Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are putting together the pieces and parts to have our Wildlife in Seattle Urban Carnivore project this evening. We've had a little bit of technical difficulties, so we're starting a few minutes late, but we're getting everything in line. Thank you for your patience. While we wait to make sure that we can get everybody who's joined us in the Zoom room, let me introduce our speakers. We'll start with Katie Remine. Here's Katie. Katie is the Living Northwest Conservation Coordinator in the Wildlife Conservation Program of the Woodland Park Zoo here in Seattle. And Katie has a bachelor's degree in biology and a minor in African Studies from Colorado College. And then she completed her Master's of Science in Biology and Conservation Management at the Imperial College in London. Katie works to coordinate the zoo's involvement in the Pacific Northwest conservation programs, and she works on projects that run the gamut from local endangered species conservation to helping communities coexist with carnivores, which we'll hear about tonight, as well as working with pollinators. Our other speaker is Dr. Mark Jordan. Mark is an associate professor of biology here at Seattle University, and Mark has his bachelor's in biology from the University of Puget Sound. His PhD is in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. His research interests include urban ecology, population monitoring of carnivores, and the genetics of species of conservation concern. And somewhere in Mark's history, he taught at Green Mountain College and the Vermont Law School. So he's worked across the country. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation by these two conservation leaders in our community, and then we'll have Q&A. And so I think when we get, excuse me, to the Q&A, if people put comments or questions in the chat room, then I'll facilitate the discussion. And so I think we're going to just wait another minute or two. Right now we have about 75 participants with us this evening. I know we had more than 150 people originally signed up, so we're going to give another moment to see if we can get everything done. The mystery man behind the black screen, Joey Manson. Joey runs Audubon, Washington's Seward Park Environmental Education Center. And when he's not being the center director, he's helping put together engaging programs for our community to learn about conservation and think about conservation. But tonight, he's also tech support. So he's a multi-talented man who's helping us get this to work tonight. So.
Thanks, Deborah. Glad to be here.
Katie, are you the owner of our slideshow?
Yep, so just whenever you're ready, I can go to the next slide.
Any feedback? Should we get going?
Let's go ahead and get it going.
Excellent. Why don't you go with our first slide, Katie?
Okay, here we go.
Off we go.
All right, anything else you would like to say, Deborah, by way of introduction before we get started?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Those of you who are familiar with Seward Park Environmental Education Center, we're based near Lake Washington, right on the corner of Lake Washington, and we run programs in the community to try to connect people with nature, provide more information and understanding of science and conservation, and really be a hub for our community. Because of COVID, we've had to change our programming this year and aren't running summer camps or many of our programs, but instead we've tried to use the power of our technology to still provide great programming to people. We offer these programs free, but should you choose to support our work, we would be grateful. I will turn the program over to our experts, Katie and Mark. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. Yeah, Mark and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. So I'm Katie Remine. I'm the Living Northwest Conservation Coordinator with Woodland Park Zoo.
And I'm Mark Jordan, and I'm an Associate Professor of Biology at Seattle University.
And our third project coordinator, Dr. Robert Long, couldn't be with us tonight, but he's one of the collaborators on this project. So today we'll talk about our Seattle Urban Carnivore Project and how we use digital monitoring, online reporting tools, and community engagement to increase human-wildlife coexistence here in the Seattle area. So over the last decade or so, there's been increasing interest in the intersection of wildlife and people in suburban and urban landscapes. There's even a recent guide out from Lonely Planet that's a guide to urban animals around the world. And with that, there's also been increasing concern about those species that live closer and closer to people. We've seen species like coyotes that are so adaptable show up in these increasingly developed and urbanized areas. So it's clear that if we want people to be able to survive and thrive in urban areas, as well as our local carnivores to survive and thrive in urban areas, it's really going to take all members of our communities to help facilitate that coexistence. And here in Seattle, it's a particularly relevant issue for us. We have a population in the greater metropolitan area of around 3.5 million people, but we're also right next to, and you might be able to see Mount Rainier off in the background of this picture. We're right next to some of the largest and wildest public lands in the contiguous United States. So this is definitely a relevant issue for us, and that's one of the reasons that we started this Seattle Urban Carnivore Project.
So as Katie mentioned, all of this context led to Katie and Robert Long and myself having some conversations over the years about wanting to put together a project to look at some of these questions. And last spring, we launched the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project that really leverages our complementary skill sets around camera trapping, wildlife monitoring, and community engagement. And we've developed a project that uses primarily camera trapping, but we'll talk about some other ways in which we're collecting data and engaging the community. But we're using camera trapping to learn about these 8 carnivores that live in the greater Seattle area. So these are our main species. Worth noting, when you think about carnivore, you might be thinking meat eater. We aren't studying any raptors or any birds that are carnivorous. We're focusing just on the mammals. So these are the 8 common focal carnivores that we're studying. Some of you who maybe have taken a semester or 2 of biology might recognize that one of these critters is not actually a member of the order Carnivora. And I'm curious, I think we can make this work. If you would like to participate, you can type into the Q&A which of these 8 you think is not actually a true carnivore in the taxonomic sense. Let's see what we get from this.
Oh, yeah, we're getting
Oh
a whole
goodness,
bunch of
you
answers.
guys are killing it. All right, great. Well done, well done. You are right. Opossum. So opossums are actually marsupials. And they're the only marsupial in North America. They are native to North America, although not necessarily to this region. They expanded west with sort of settler colonial settlements moving west as well, but they are native to North America. And we lump them in because ecologically they're pretty similar. They're a generalist, but they definitely have a carnivorous diet and they interact and compete with some of these other species. One more question for the Q&A, and that is, if you all had to guess, which of these 8 do you think are the ones we most commonly observe, either with our camera traps or with our community reporting tool? Okay.
Got a few
Great.
guesses.
Trash panda. Yes. All right. Hold those thoughts and we'll show you some of our results in a little bit and you can see how you did.
Great.
So getting into the specifics of how the camera trapping works, we have set up a protocol that is based on one developed by the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which is at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And this is a collaborative multi-city project with collaborators in now over 20 cities in North America, ranging in size from Los Angeles to some of the smaller cities, including Ames, Iowa, Jackson, Mississippi. So a real broad range of urban areas, but the basic underlying idea in all of them is to set up camera traps along a transect that goes from urban to wildland, so that we are observing what the wildlife are doing in the most urban parts of the city, but also in the more wilder suburban or ex-urban fringes. Our own implementation of that are these two transects you can see on this map. So one of them starting at Discovery Park and running out through Carnation and into Duval. And then the other one starting at the Port of Seattle, and then it makes a little turn down in Tukwila and Renton, and then heads out toward Maple Valley. And along each of these transects, then we've identified parks where we've placed cameras. So we've used over 30 camera trap sites at these various parks, each of those green pins representing one of those locations where we've set up cameras starting in April of 2019. And then the orange dots are a handful of off-transect locations that we've also incorporated into the study. They're not part of the Urban Wildlife Information Network protocol, but we've put them in different spots for various community engagement reasons. For example, you can see there's an orange dot right there in Seward Park where there's a new camera running. And then Katie can also talk to you about some of the work out in Issaquah that she's participated in.
Yeah, and we had a question about how a transect works running across the lake, and we don't have any cameras in the lake.
Yes.
We just kind of skipped that part because we're focused on terrestrial mammals, but good question. So we knew from the outset that we did want to engage community volunteers in this project. And so when we initially wrote up our protocol, we tried to do that in such a way that it's clear and accessible for youth and adult volunteers to join us in this work. We started out initially with some of our audiences that were already engaged with the zoo, including our youth volunteers at the time. Here's one of our youth teams last year setting up their camera. We also engaged our own zoo staff, as well as some retired staff and other adult volunteers. And this gave people, you know, who may not have a chance to actually get out in the field and to do conservation research work, to get an experience with that kind of work. Even if they're already connected with the zoo, they maybe don't have those kinds of opportunities. So this really gave them a chance to participate directly in our conservation work. This last year, we reached out through some events and zoo communications, and we onboarded 30 new volunteers into the project. We actually haven't even met all those volunteers in person. This is a screenshot of our training that had to become an online training in March. This is Robert Long delivering that training. But we did get folks trained. We, of course, had to take a pause on the work for a few months, of course. But we slowly have been able over the last month or so to get our teams out and setting up their cameras for this season. So that's been great. It's definitely been a different kind of a year, but so far things are still going well with the project.
One of the other audiences we've been able to engage have been undergraduates who attend Seattle University. And there's a lot of good research on the benefits undergraduates get, especially women and underrepresented minorities really develop a good sense of career planning and self-efficacy from independent research projects that go beyond just a lab session, maybe in one class. So we've been able to work with quite a few undergrad students on this project who have helped us check the cameras, set them up in the field, and also tag the photos when they come back in. And I think that underscores one of the points that we really try to emphasize with our work and are trying to continually improve upon, which is just making both engagement with our students and our community members more inclusive. I think that wildlife has traditionally been focused on, wildlife research has traditionally been focused on wild places, natural areas, and it's really tended to ignore a lot of urban areas and a lot of communities and individuals who would like to participate in the research. So we've tried to reach out and broaden our project to make sure it's more inclusive for more people to be able to get involved.
Yeah. And I think we have several of our volunteers on with us this evening. So if you're here and want to post a quick note in the chat, maybe a favorite species that you've observed on your cameras. Yeah, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for all that you do to really keep this project going. And so another way that we have incorporated public participation in this project is by launching the Carnivore Spotter online reporting tool. And we're very excited because it launched just a year ago yesterday. I can't believe it's been a year already. And so this is an online tool that people can use to report sightings of urban carnivores. We had a lot of really great initial participation, and now as of last month, we have over 4,000, I think something like 4,300 reports. This information is really important. It kind of, you know, a lot of people report these kinds of sightings on their social media and in their neighborhood, which is great. But by reporting here on Carnivore Spotter, this really complements the information we're getting through our camera trapping. And we're learning about what kinds of things people are seeing and where they're seeing them. So people can upload photos or videos with their reports or audio recordings. And we do review those, our project staff, we do review those, and if they have media, then we verify them. So it's great to get photos and videos or audio with the reports, because then we can actually verify the identifications. So if you see reports that you're curious about, if you find that it has a photo or video or audio recording with it, then you can know that that's a verified report. But we will take any reports, even if you don't happen to capture that photo. So this screenshot is just a little zoomed in. This is from a few days ago and shows the reports that we do have for Seward Park and around the area. You can see lots of coyotes, raccoons, some river otters as well. So keep those reports coming in. They're really great to add to the data set we're getting. And this allows people in the community to participate in the project as well. And then we also have started to put our camera traps, photos that we get from our camera traps, up into this platform called Zooniverse. And on Zooniverse, there are a lot of different projects you can participate in, but mostly helping research that has like a visual task. So in our case, we're asking people to help us identify the animals in the photos. So the link is at the bottom of the page, and we'll show it later. But this allows really anyone, anywhere, to help us with the project by putting those identifications on the photos. I will say I don't think we have photos available at the moment in Zooniverse, but we should have a lot of photos available soon. So keep your eyes on that.
So based on those primary channels of data, both the Carnivore Spotter as well as the camera trapping, and then our community engagement through volunteers and also the Carnivore Spotter, that kind of highlights our 4 main project goals for the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. And notice the first one up at the top, even before any sort of scientific research goal, is to engage the local community. That's really important to us, and it really underscores a lot of the work we do, is ways to get folks like you who are in the community engaged in some way or other with the project. And then second, and related to that, is to develop strategies for coexistence with carnivores. I think that there's a lot of potential for kind of enthusiasm and excitement around carnivores, but also potential for conflict. And what we've tried to do is find ways to communicate, ways to better coexist with these species, and kind of learn more about these species in urban areas. We're also collaborating with other projects. So for example, there's the Urban Wildlife Information Network, plus we have some other projects with local labs doing, for example, scat collection to look at diet of coyotes is another project that we've got developing. And then finally, we want to better understand the science of it and how do these species ecology change in urban areas. And this is something that's very interesting to me as a research wildlife biologists to just see how, as you move into a more urban area, how does the behavior, how do the spacing patterns and all these things change for each of these species? Which species sort of drop off as you get more urban and which actually seem to like the more urban areas better? And then that really feeds into our understanding of strategies for coexistence. Learning more, not just about how to coexist with each of these species in isolation, but learning, well, maybe, for example, coyote behavior is different in more urban areas than in more rural areas. For example, there's some research that shows their diet changes quite a bit and is more human food-based in more urbanized or more densely populated areas. So our strategies for communicating how to coexist with these species might vary depending on where we are.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully get to all of your questions, but for right now, Mark, there's one about the pictures on this slide, and it kind of looks like they're looking at the camera. So we were wondering about that.
So they often will investigate the camera. There's actually, I don't know if you can see it in any of these, in the bobcat one on the left, there's a little black square that's nailed to that tree, and that has a scent lure in it. And that's the main thing that we attract them to the area with. So we get a lot of pictures of them investigating that. As for the camera itself, sometimes the camera will make a light clicking noise, so they might be interested in that. Also, these species are all very tuned into their environment, so they're going to be kind of investigating if there's something new that's attached to a tree. In terms of the flash is infrared, so they wouldn't see any flash if it went off at night. But I do think that they're all very curious, at least, about what this new thing is that showed up in their environment. So here are some of our results and some fun pictures of the wildlife we've been capturing. And as you might guess, the more urban sites, so the ones closer in, really in Seattle proper and down along the Duwamish, we're mostly getting some of the species you might be more familiar with if you live in these areas. We've got raccoons, we've got possums, and coyotes are the main things we're seeing at these camera sites, at least among the carnivores. And then as you move further out across the lake and into less urban areas, I notice the coyotes are still there. And in some ways, they're probably the most common across the range. We're going to see them just about everywhere. But you also start to pick up more of the what we would consider wild species like bobcats and black bears. And another quiz for you all. Go ahead and type into the Q&A. What do you think that is on the bottom right? We're going to give you some camera trap practice here. Yeah, it does look like a bat. Those of you who guessed flying squirrel are correct. That is, in fact, a flying squirrel. All right.
Great. Yeah, we weren't expecting that one.
No, absolutely not. And it's a great action shot too. So here is the payoff for those of you who answered earlier what you thought was the most common. If you guessed coyote or raccoon/trash panda, you were correct, because the most popular one kind of depended on the method we used for collecting the data. So these show you the proportion of all of our captures that are represented by each species. And these are just the 5 most common. The other 3 species, the otter and the cougar and the red fox, we didn't really get enough to even make it onto this slide. But you'll see that the camera trap, by far the winner was the raccoon. And raccoons and coyotes were the most common of the most common 2 species we got with camera traps. And the black bears and bobcats were really not common at all. Interestingly, the relative ranking and numbers are pretty different for carnivore spotter reports. A lot of our reports, nearly, well, I would say over 50% of them are coyotes, and then we're getting about 20% of them raccoons and about 10% each black bear and bobcat. And I think that tells us both something about where our camera traps are versus where people are looking, but I think also what people are interested in sharing with us on Carnivore Spotter. I'm guessing a lot of you probably have raccoon reports you could make, but maybe aren't making them as much just because they seem so common.
Yeah, and we're getting some really interesting pictures into the lives of urban carnivores through the reports coming in through Carnivore Spotter. And we are actually just starting to dive into taking a more quantitative look at some of this information. We're working on coding those 4,000 plus reports and starting to look at the types of interactions we're seeing, where reports are coming from, and a few different parameters that we're looking at. But in the meantime, just through the images that we're getting, we're really seeing what life looks like for these urban carnivores, at least from the perspective of people who've observed them, or in some cases gotten their own camera trap pictures of them. So in this case, these are some images of what bears are up to in our communities. And then also for the bobcats, the coyotes, the opossums, and the raccoon. I love this picture of the raccoon catching some rest in a tree that's clearly right next to an industrial area. So it's really fun to get these kinds of images. We also look at the comments and are tracking the kinds of interactions and questions that people have about these carnivores. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and share some of the videos that have come in through Carnivore Spotter. What we're seeing is that carnivores are quite playful and of course very cute as well. So we'll share a couple of videos. So this first one is actually a coyote and a black bear interacting, and this happened over in Carnation. And so I will share that for you. I think I can also make it bigger, but watch carefully and see how these two interact. I'll play it probably twice. Here we go again. So really interesting interactions there. And then I'll do this next one. And this one was a coyote that was very curious about something in these folks' front yard. This is from Astoria, Oregon. I'll play that part again. So the coyote decided it really wanted that pinwheel there. So that was quite interesting as well. And then this one, here I'll make sure I'm sharing the right screen. There you go. Make it bigger. So look down in the bottom right corner here, and you can see the mother bobcat and the kittens in the grass. I'm not sure where that one was from. I don't have the location information on that one. And then finally, and then again, let me make sure I'm sharing the right
otter family crossing the road. So cute.
I'll show you that one bigger.
Little otter family crossing the road. So cute. Oh, I thought
they made it successfully across the road. So now I'll pop back to our PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that our urban carnivores can be quite playful, and we're getting in a lot of really cute pictures of them as well. So we're still working on the more quantitative analysis, as I mentioned, but it's also, we're learning a lot just through the kinds of photos and videos we're getting and the comments that people are making. There's also obviously, you know, some negative interactions people are having and a lot of questions about those interactions as well. So in a minute, we'll turn over to Q&A, but we wanted to talk about a few ways you can get involved in this program. One way we've been working, because of some grant funding that we've been working really closely out in Issaquah with the city and with community volunteers out there. And I'm really happy to share that the community volunteers just launched a scavenger hunt game that they worked on. It's called the Great Carnivore Discovery Adventure Lab. It just launched, they built it and it just launched last week. And basically, if you have a geocaching account or you create one and you download the Adventure Lab app, if you go out to Issaquah, you'll find this scavenger hunt, and it's about 10 stops, takes about an hour and a half to complete. And at each stop, you learn about local carnivores and tips for coexisting with local carnivores. So we hope you'll join us in trying out the Great Carnivore Discovery game over in Issaquah. And other ways to be involved, of course, we mentioned adding your observations to Carnivore Spotter. And as we get some more photos up on Zooniverse, you can go to Zooniverse and help to code those photos. We will be recruiting volunteers for the camera trapping program for 2021. We don't run the training until usually about March, but we will recruit in the winter. So for the time being, you can just email seattlecarnivores@zoo.org and we'll add you to our interest list for next year. And if you do know a community group or neighborhood association whose members want to learn more, we are open to giving community presentations. That's one way we're using the Carnivore Spotter information, is to help us to see both where there are a lot of reports coming in and maybe people would like to talk and discuss strategies for coexistence, but also we'd like to reach out to communities where maybe we're not getting a lot of reports yet, where people aren't aware of the Carnivore Spotter tool, or maybe would like some help sort of learning more about the carnivores that are in their area. And our website is zoo.org/Seattle Carnivores, where you can also go to learn more. So I know we have some questions in the chat already, and then we can take more questions. So I guess we can start maybe with the ones in the chat. And Mark, if you have any you'd like to answer, feel free to go with that, or Deborah, either way.
Why don't I help with the questions
Great.
in the chat, and then you guys can be the pros and answer them, because
Perfect.
that's the hard part.
That
Great.
sounds good. I was
So-
trying to type some responses and it quickly exceeded my multitasking ability. So I would love for you to manage this.
I'll try. We've had a lot of questions, so I won't cover every single one, but I'll pick some highlights. Someone asked earlier in the list of questions, have you seen a change in the animal patterns since the stay-at-home orders went into place and everyone's been staying indoors?
We would love to be able to answer that question. Because of the stay-at-home order, we weren't also able to go out and check our cameras. So we essentially have quite a few months of backed up data. We did have cameras out, at least in some of the places during the stay-at-home order. So we're hoping to see some, if there are changes, we're hoping to be able to pick that up. Also, we're working with our collaborators in the broader North American network, the UN network, to answer that same question. So I would say stay tuned. We don't have any answers now, but we're hoping to have something kind of analyzed by the fall or winter.
So tell us a little bit more about the broader network.
So this is the Urban Wildlife Information Network. So these are all these 20+ cities across North America. And so each of them had different stay-at-home orders at different times. So it's really a very interesting challenge to try to tease out then what does the data in Los Angeles, how does that compare to Seattle, to Portland, to Jackson, Mississippi?
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So another question was more about the data. So maybe you are still working on this, but the gentleman who asked about the jumping across the lake wanted to come back and say, okay, so what's the more general idea of how do you deal with discontinuous data? How do you interpret patterns when you've got these big changes because there's a lake in the way or something like that?
I would think of it as the transect's really a tool to help us get a gradient of urbanization, so that the transect itself isn't necessarily defining the sampling scheme, except to give us a place to narrow down where we're searching. And so we use that as a tool to identify an urban to less urban areas. And then we can use the different metrics to actually define urban. For example, the amount of what we call impervious surfaces around an area is a good predictor or describer urbanness. So the transect is the tool to help us lay out the locations of our parks, but it's not necessarily, the parks then themselves are far enough apart from each other that they're statistically independent from a research standpoint. So the discontinuity in the lake shouldn't have any negative impacts or complications for the analysis of the data. Great question.
So another person wanted to know, since there's so many raccoons that we've been observing or you've got, and maybe they're underreported in your study, are raccoons beneficial to our environment? And if so, in what way?
You bet. Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a raccoon lover, so maybe Katie can also answer because I'm a little biased. But I would say like any carnivores in general play an important role in just structuring ecosystems. They help maintain or reduce levels of herbivores that might eat excessive vegetation. Raccoons are also generalists, so they might eat a wide variety of things from plants to animals. It can definitely be a nuisance. I won't ignore that, but they can be a nuisance in urban environments. But I do think that they can play a pretty important role in keeping down populations of smaller herbivores, maybe mice and rats, for example. So they do have some sort of important role.
Katie, do you want to chime in?
I agree with that.
I'm going to have trouble keeping up with all the questions.
I know.
Some of them were general ones and not some of the technical ones. But I'll ask one technical one because everyone's going to wish we knew this. What are the estimated numbers of each of our 8 carnivores that you're tracking in the greater Seattle area?
Yeah, for sure. So for sure we wouldn't get that from Carnivore Spotter because that's, just people's observations of them, and of course you might get multiple observations of the same individual, which is fine. It's great to know when people are seeing carnivores, so it's okay for us to get multiple reports of the same individual. But obviously, yeah, from Carnivore Spotter, we're not going to get that. And I think, Mark, you could probably talk more about the camera trapping. And
I think with the camera trapping, really the best we can do is to get local population estimates around each camera. Like, are we getting multiple individuals for those species that you can kind of tell apart coming to the camera? And then you would have to extrapolate from each of those individual sites across the urban area. So I think in terms of raw numbers, it's a bit of a tricky leap to go from the camera trap data to just how many there are. But I do think what they do give us is some good information about locations, which parts of the city and which types of habitats these species are using. So they're really helpful for telling us where each species is, if not as much for how many.
That's helpful. There was another related question about if we followed a natural pathway or a active green zone or some corridor like the Burke-Gilman Trail, would you expect to get different information about the carnivores and their distributions?
So in other words, if we use that as our transect, I would think it would really. It's interesting because animals will use human trails as movement corridors, so we might see them along that. But a busier one like the Burke-Gilman Trail might not get as much activity. Certainly, what you would see is certain times of day. Maybe you would see movement. So I think you would get some interesting information about movement or commuting. Is sometimes what I think of for some of these species, where they're moving through different habitats. So that might be an interesting addition. And we do have a site that's not too far from the Burke-Gilman Trail and a few other sites that are near some of these regional trails that kind of get at some of those questions you're asking.
So we want to talk, a couple of people want to talk a little bit more about who's involved. And so one person asks, how can we get the program to engage more diverse communities and get more participation from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, or from communities of people with special needs?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. One, I will just let you all know about an upcoming event that Woodland Park Zoo is hosting. We have a colleague in Tacoma who runs a very similar urban carnivore project, Chris Schell with UW Tacoma. He's an African-American conservation biologist, and the zoo's hosting an event on April 27th about the intersection of conservation work and racism within the field. And Chris will be one of the presenters. He also follows the same protocol we do and has similar transects and camera trapping, so we've collaborated. So if you're interested in that, that particular topic, I definitely encourage you to check out the zoo's website and join us for that conversation.
Katie, you said it was April 22nd, but you
Sorry, August.
August? Okay.
August, yeah, August 27th.
Go find it on zoo.org.
Yep, zoo.org, you can find that. And so, you know, we're definitely have worked with some of our protocols to make them accessible. And one of the things that's great about having at least some of our engagement online is it really broadens out, especially for folks who might not physically be able to get out in the field and help us with the field work. There are ways to contribute the data in that way. And as we mentioned with Carnivore Spotter, one of the things we're interested in looking at are those cold spots. Where are we not getting reports? That doesn't mean that there aren't carnivores there. Most likely it means that we haven't reached those communities. And so that's something that we are looking to do with future support, is to kind of look at those cold spots and think about how we can reach some communities who maybe aren't engaged with their local carnivores, but who may have, you know, concern and interest about coexistence as well. So, and we welcome your ideas too. We mentioned, you know, if you have groups that you think would be interested and that could come talk and work with the zoo, we'd love to hear about that as well. And I think Mark mentioned through his working with his undergraduates, it definitely provides an opportunity for a lot of audiences that maybe wouldn't have that chance, and that can be a real kind of empowering stepping stone for different undergraduate students.
We have lots of technical questions. I'll ask a couple, but first, kind of a fun one. With all those camera traps, are you getting data on other animals, deer, skunk, other wildlife?
We haven't got skunk yet, I believe. We do, and we also, I just saw a question about cougars. We have not gotten cougars yet on any of our project cameras, but of course we know that means they're not out there. I mean, doesn't mean they're not out there. But we do have some on Carnivore Spotter. We do get sightings of deer. We're not, you know, analyzing those necessarily for this project at this moment, but we code all that data, and that data is available, and so we could, or if someone was interested, they could look at that deer data as well.
And oodles of squirrels.
Yeah.
There are two questions basically asking, could you have these data be connected to other kinds of questions? So one is, could this research be used in conjunction with research on animal transmitted diseases? And one person wants to know about some similar work that's getting done in Southern California, where data are collected on how rodenticides may be impacting wildlife species. So are your data going to be able to be connected to other kinds of ecological or wildlife research?
Do you want to talk about mange, Katie?
Yeah, I'll mention really quick and then pass to Mark. One thing we are able to track, because you can see it visually, is mange can be an issue in coyote populations, and we have seen a couple of individuals with mange. So far, what's interesting, so that's where they have issues with the hair, and they'll lose a lot of hair. What's interesting is that the couple places we've seen that, we've seen an individual who clearly is suffering from mange, but also an individual that looks very healthy. So they seem to be, you know, in the same place. So again, we haven't pursued that line of research, but one definitely could with this data.
And then there was a question about rodenticides and how those kind of amplify up the food chain and have been affecting carnivores. And unfortunately, the study design we have for now can't really test that very easily, because you really need to have an animal, at least as far as I understand, and this isn't my area of work, but you really need an animal on hand to take a blood sample or a tissue sample. And all of our work is photograph based, or video or audio in the case of Carnivore Spotter. So we aren't really handling any animals in order to collect those kinds of data. It would be great to find out if these things are happening, but we just don't have the study set up in that way.
So one person asked about, they had an experience of walking their puppy across the UW campus and being followed by a coyote. And they wondered if they should be worried about the puppy's welfare. And I know that many people that I have run into in Seattle are afraid that there are coyote in the city. So should we be worried for our puppies, or should we be worried about these animals sharing the city with us?
Yeah, that is a great question, and something I know a lot of us think about often and talk to people about often. I think, you know, the idea of coexistence is, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we can survive and thrive, and the wildlife can survive and thrive. And a lot of times that comes down to kind of being respectful of each other's space. And so with coyotes, that could mean that, you know, if there's a coyote in your backyard and that's not a place that you want the coyote to be, their strategy is called humane hazing, and it's as simple as shouting, you know, banging pots and pans, and just trying to help the coyote understand, like, it's not really welcome in this space. And likewise, sometimes if you happen to come close to where a coyote is denning, they will sometimes what's called escorting. They might walk and just make sure that you're going away, basically, and not kind of coming near their home place or their family. And so for the most part, when we engage in that kind of respecting each other's space, we shouldn't have issues. The biggest problems come when we leave out attractants, so foods that might bring coyotes in, or other carnivores. So that includes leaving pet food outdoors, leaving trash unsecured, things like that. With pets, it's definitely recommended to keep your pets inside from dusk until dawn, so during the nighttime. And also, it is safest to walk your pet on a leash. Some conflicts can occur when a pet might run out and get in trouble and then run back to you with possibly an animal behind it. So really, keeping your pet on a leash is the best thing you can do to avoid conflicts. And then if you get into a space where you don't feel comfortable, again, that humane hazing, yelling. I've had an experience, you know, with a coyote in Seattle, and as soon as it kind of like knew that people were looking at it, it just wanted to get away. And so for the most part, if you, it's okay for us to kind of use those strategies to keep that respectful distance between us and local wildlife.
Well, how much space does an individual coyote use, or do they only come in groups? And then how much space does the group need?
Mm-hmm. It really depends. Sorry, that's such a scientist answer, but it really, what we've noticed, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I don't know if you've looked at them recently, Katie, but we do notice that as you move further into the city, home ranges actually shrink for coyotes and raccoons. I don't know about other urban critters, probably because their resource needs are getting met in a smaller area because there are human supplied sources of food. And then in terms of pack size, packs of coyotes are often, the size is often over-reported because when they're howling, they can create these overtones that makes it sound like a lot more than they are, but it's usually a small, small family group gathered together.
Okay, that's helpful. It means if you live in a habitat that has lots of good food for coyotes, you're going to have, like if your backyard has a lot of squirrels, the coyotes are going to be there more likely.
Possibly, yeah.
Maybe.
So I think that's why, and I just posted a link in the answer to Yvette L's question for humane hazing. So if you wanted to go to I think you can access the answered part of the Q&A, you can find that link there for if you do get coyotes in your backyard.
That's good, thank you. Any advice on safe distancing from mother raccoons when she's traveling with her kittens?
I would say just give her space would be if possible, give her space. I think that particularly any animal when it's around its young is going to be more defensive. So I would say that definitely try to keep your distance. If it's in a tree that's say in your yard, then just, I guess, be aware of what's mom and kids' daily patterns so that you're doing your best not to disrupt them. And eventually, as we move into fall, they're going to start going their separate ways and be less tightly knit together.
Okay, a couple more biology questions about coyotes. Are they pack hunters the way wolves are? Or are they more individuals? And if you build on this coyote and pets and the interaction in the urban environment question, what's their main food source? What are they eating in the urban environment?
I'll take one of those. Which
Okay.
one do you want, Mark?
Do you want to talk about the food source one?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that I'll get to another question through that as well. We are just about, Woodland Park Zoo and Seattle University and University of Washington are just about to launch with a graduate student at UW a study on coyote diets in Seattle. So in a couple of years, we'll have a more definitive answer for Seattle in particular. And that study will focus on looking at coyote scat and seeing what they eat and quantifying, what makes up their diet in Seattle. But there have been studies in other locations in the US, other cities, other urban areas. And as Mark referenced before, in urban areas, their diet is a bit different than in suburban areas. And there's a lot of human-derived food sources, and that meaning our trash, our food that we throw away or things like that, they will directly eat. They have in those studies also found that cats can be part of the coyote's diet, not a major part of their diet, but also not an insignificant part. That can include feral cats, but it could also include pet cats. The interesting thing, I think, for us to find out will be also how much they are eating things like rats and what services they're providing in a sense here in the city. So we'll be really interested to get those results. But yeah, it's often a mix of sort of natural sources like rabbits and rats and things like that, human-derived sources, mostly from food that we might dispose of, as well as cats. And yeah, they're very opportunistic. So there's a lot of different things that go into a coyote diet.
There's a question related to coyote diet. So Mark, before you go on to the pack hunters or not, one of our visitors commented that there seems to be rabbits increasing around Seward Park. Do we have any information about the coyote populations and the rabbit populations? And do you see rabbits in your camera traps so you could see changes in the rabbit population? What do we know about the coyote rabbit?
That's a great question too. We were getting that a lot last year too. So I think I think there's someone at UW who might be studying rabbits in our urban areas. So I don't have an answer to kind of the population trends. Certainly we see more of them in the springtime because that's when they're having their kits and they're out and about. But I don't know for sure the population trends. I do know that coyotes will hunt those rabbits, but I don't know about how the populations might be changing here.
And I would say anecdotally from other camera trapping projects going back to 2012 up to now, I have noticed a kind of steady And it's, again, it's anecdotal, but an increase in the number of pictures of rabbits that we're getting. And I would love to actually answer the question for Seward Park. In fact, this picture that's on the slide now is a coyote that was photographed at Seward Park. And I can't remember what the timestamp is. What is it? 2017. That just showed up a few years ago. But we haven't had cameras out to watch what's happening with the rabbits since then. But I guess if they're in the neighborhood, that's maybe those coyotes aren't enough to reduce the rabbit population.
So we'll go back to do they hunt solo or in groups like wolves?
I would say closer to solo, that they're not hunting in large groups like wolves. Like they don't, to my knowledge, take down prey that is bigger than them the way wolves would, that they're much more kind of individual. They might live in small family groups, but the hunting itself is much more individualized.
So do we know what they're doing when they're all yipping and it sounds like there's so many of them?
I honestly don't. I'm not a coyoteologist.
Yeah, I think they're, you know, it happens a lot more in the springtime. Oh, great. And someone posted our link about rabbits in the Q&A. That's great. It definitely happens more in the springtime when the new pups are just kind of emerging from the den. But yeah, I don't know specifically the function of that. It might be that they're seeing who else is around or what's going on with the other family groups in the area. Yeah.
There's a follow-on question. Do we know if they're territorial?
Generally, yes. In cities, some of those territorial rules can break down, so we don't know for sure.
Earlier, we had a question about, do you have any preliminary results or initial conclusions from the work, or is it too early?
I'd say it's a little too early, but we now have a full year's worth of data, which we've wanted to be able to look at maybe some seasonal trends. So we started the project with the camera trapping in April. So we've now got a full year's worth of data. I think COVID kind of derailed a lot of best laid plans, so we haven't dug into it too much, but we would like to start looking at some of the relationships between species, where some species appear and others don't. Are there any interactions? And then also looking at maybe some census data. How does human population density or the median income in certain neighborhoods, like is there what's called a luxury effect in terms of certain wildlife showing up in fancier neighborhoods? We'd like to really start testing those questions, but we're a little behind in terms of catching up on the data because of everything that's been going on the last few months.
Right. If you could, would you expand the geography of this study, or do you want to go deeper where you are?
I think.
Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, because we're part of that national network, and Tacoma with Chris Schell leading that, you know, so in a sense, we already have sort of the whole Seattle-Tacoma area covered. And so, you know, by pooling all of that data, it really is quite an expansive data set. So I think at this point, we probably would maintain sort of the coverage, but try to kind of engage more with the data and also in those collaborations to look at data across the country.
Yeah, I would second what Katie just said.
And then we might have some areas which are a little too quiet on your carnivore spotter where we could recruit.
Yes. Yeah, there's actually there's no geographic boundaries on carnivore spotter, so you can report really from anywhere.
Yeah, so I guess if that's...
Be careful. Be careful what you just offered.
So if there is any opportunity for expansion, I think it's more around outreach and community engagement and getting carnivore spotter more widespread than the camera trapping. I think the camera trapping, we're relatively satisfied with the depth of coverage that we've got, especially as Katie mentioned, with Chris and the Point Defiance Zoo down in Tacoma's projects.
That makes sense. And is anyone physically tagging any of our carnivores with chips or other kind of GPS monitoring or anything like that?
No one at present in the area is doing any live trapping that I know
Someone wants to know, is it useful to report roadkills?
For this project, we're mostly interested in observations of live carnivores, because we're really wanting to know, where they're at when they're out and about. But there is a project, if you're in the I-90 area from I think just past Issaquah over the freeway, there is a project, I believe it's called I-90 Wildlife Watch, and that project is definitely interested in reports of roadkill along I-90.
So for those of us who see the animals relatively frequently, should we be reporting them every time we see them in the same neighborhood? Do you want that? Someone on the questions that lives near Seward and they see a coyote there regularly, do you want every sighting?
I don't know. What do you think, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned before, we know that the carnivore spotter data represent, people, maybe the same person seeing the same coyote several times, or different people seeing the same coyote several times. I would say if you see it in the exact same spot over and over, that might be less useful. But if you see a coyote and you're not sure if it's the same one or a different one, but you see it in different places, then that would be great. I mean, that would give us a sense of kind of where it's traveling and where it's kind of frequently sort of out in the open or in a place where people might see it. So.
And I'm generally of the opinion you can never have too much data. So.
Spoken like a scientist, Mark. Thank you. Someone asked, if with the carnivore spotter, which it seems like a broader geography, do you have the data to answer whether you're seeing different densities or species distributions for places like Vashon or Bainbridge compared to Seattle or the east side?
I think given the nature of the data, I would be more comfortable talking about species distributions. We actually see a really interesting line. I mean, it's not like a straight line, but it's a real kind of clear transition over in the Sammamish area where the black bears kind of stop, and then the bobcats stop. But then you can also see the distribution of coyotes all across, and actually the raccoons decline a little bit as you head further out away from the city. So because of that, so great question, because of that broader geographic spread of carnivore spotter, we can get good answers about distribution. I think population size or density, it's a little harder because this is just individual people out there with their smartphones or going home and entering on their computer. So we don't really have a systematic way of recording when these observations are happening. So some areas might just have a lot of people who are really interested, and others might have fewer people. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's more carnivores in the area where we're getting a lot of reports. It's just that there are more people who are excited about the carnivores. But for distribution questions, it's been great.
So historically, would we have had those animals that now are stopping at Issaquah, would they have come all the way down to Puget Sound? Our bears and our cougar would have been?
Yeah, I think that, so interestingly, historically, I think most of the ones that disappear or start to trail off over in the east side would come all the way down to Puget Sound. I also think we would have historically had a lot fewer coyotes. That coyotes are sort of a Great Plains adapted animal, and having them on this side of the Cascades at all is kind of a novel thing, and really just maybe something of the 20th century. As far as the records I've seen, that there wasn't much record of coyotes over here prior to the 20th century.
Okay, so we want to know more about geography of carnivore spotter. Are we getting spottings in Snohomish County, such as Mill Creek, Everett, Marysville? I'm not sure if this is somebody who's trying to recruit out there.
We'd love them. Yeah, really. Yeah, I think the more the better wherever they are. We actually just, with Chris Schell and Point Defiance Zoo in Tacoma, we launched kind of a Tacoma version of Carnivore Spotter. That's carnivorespotter.org/Tacoma. And the data all goes in the same place. It just, when you go in through that link, it centers on Tacoma because they're communicating with their audiences, and that's easier for their audiences to go in and report from there. So we will look in the future about maybe putting you know, carnivore spotter in other cities too. So yeah, let us know, even across the country.
Fun. One of our guests mentions that she knows there's a coyote den in the ravine near her home in Magnuson. Would it be helpful to have a camera there? Or otherwise, how do you decide where you want cameras?
Yeah, yeah. Mark, I'll throw that one your way, but I think the answer is we do have a camera
Yeah,
there.
I think the answer is we do in fact already have a camera down there. So and we've gotten some great coyote photos, and so.
But as far as the initial selection of sites, I think you mentioned a bit about that, but.
Yeah, so we used the transect as our guide, and then what we tried to do was just get an even distribution of really urban, slightly less urban, moderately urban, all the way out to the exurb, so that we're sampling roughly the same number of camera sites in each level of urbanization. So that's how we might choose additional sites. If we say lose a site for whatever reason, then if we need to pick one up, we'll want to replicate the amount of urbanization that was around that site.
That sounds great. We have another fact we want the answer to. How many coyotes are there in Seward Park? Do we know?
That's a good question. There've been different numbers over time. My understanding is there is a den in Seward Park this year, and I think they have about 5 pups. And you know, that seems like a pretty average number, kind of right in the middle maybe of the average. I don't know, Mark, if you have.
Yeah, that's the best information I have as well.
Okay, our questions are starting to taper off. We've had a lot of coyote questions. I personally have a passion for bobcat, and I'm curious, are the bobcat also more likely to be in the exurbs and in the less populated areas, or do we sometimes get bobcats in Seattle?
So far, they've really, been kind of on the east side of Lake Washington. They do come, you know, kind of right up to that eastern edge of Lake Washington and some of our camera sites. And we get a lot of people reporting. I think something really interesting for this kind of research and for carnivore spotter in particular is that with the increasing use of kind of front door and back door security cameras, we have so much footage of bobcats in people's yards. If you look through Carnivore Spotter, you can filter, and so you could filter just for bobcats, and you'd see a lot of footage from those security cameras. So bobcats seem to be not uncommon, even around people's houses, but definitely more sort of towards the eastern King County area and east of Lake Washington. But people don't see them much. I think they're, you know, I think it's really these ways of observing them at night that are helping us understand where they are.
Somebody else wants to know about bobcat. The last question is there really a bobcat on Rainier Avenue? That's flawless.
Well, if there's no photo or video, then it's not a verified observation, and you'll see a lot of those. So we can't say for sure because I'm guessing there was not a photo or video with that one.
Yeah, and I would add that bobcats can be really hard to identify because they look superficially like a house cat, or maybe the other way around. If you're wanting to see a bobcat, you can see a bobcat in a house cat. And so I do wonder, we do see those bobcat colored dots in Seattle, but I don't know that we have photo evidence with any of those to verify that they're actually in the city.
Yeah. In your cameras, do you get feral cats also? So you have some view of what percentage, what cat population we have, feral cat population we have in the region?
Yeah, we do get some feral cats. In some ways, I'm a little surprised at how few we get, and often the cats look pretty well fed and have, you know, little bells or whatever on. But we do have a few sites in particular where there might be, it's either a place where people dump cats or there's a colony living there. where we get feral cats. So that's also a helpful way of looking at how these species interact with each other that we can get.
All right, we have a different favorite animal. I got mine.
Mhm.
This gentleman would like to know, what if we learned about a possum?
Ooh, that one's mine.
Yeah.
All right, so the thing that I think is most interesting about opossums is how many there are at Seward Park. That I've done projects with students over the last almost decade, and we often go to Seward Park with labs, and there is hardly a place in Seward Park, especially when you get into the magnificent forest part, less so on the edge near the nature center and the playground, but when you get deeper into the park, there's hardly a place I can set up a camera where I don't get a picture of an opossum. And that they and raccoons kind of do this in terms of forest cover, that the raccoons tend to be more common or just more, they'll occupy areas that have less forest cover, but as you increase forest cover, that seems to be where the opossums are happiest. They'll be right in the city, but only in the parks that have lots of cover. So, you know, like Schmitz Park over in West Seattle or Seward Park.
Wow, I didn't know that about them. I didn't know they would like the forest.
Yeah, no, they seem to. It's really interesting.
If you can you filter carnivore spotter to see your own reports? One of our guests has tried but hasn't been able to find out how to do that, if that's possible.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think you can. And the reason we did one thing about accessibility was we specifically did not want to have people need to create a login in order to log a report on Carnivore Spotter, because we felt like that sometimes is a barrier. And so for that reason, the reports aren't tracked, you know, by user in any way. You could zoom in on your area, like if you're reporting in a bunch of different areas, that wouldn't work as well. But if you're reporting in one area, you could zoom in and kind of look at them that way. But no, you can't filter for your own reports.
You can filter by neighborhood too, as a way if you want to zoom in a kind of specific way just to see within your neighborhood, and then you can click around to find your own reports and also see what your neighbors are reporting. Yeah.
I also wanted to mention about Carnivore Spotter. I saw a question about this. It was developed inspired by another project that Woodland Park Zoo was involved with. So there was an otter spotter app prior to this one, where we had worked with an otter researcher, and she was using the you know, kind of public reports to help her guide her research. And so that's kind of where the idea initially came from, was kind of building out Otter Spotter to become Carnivore Spotter.
Great. Someone asked earlier in the questions if there was a way the data might be used by poachers, so the sort of nefarious purposes concerned.
Yeah, so that was one of the other reasons so there's a 10-day delay between when you post an observation on Carnivore Spotter and when it populates. So at least that kind of helps with the, you know, it's not an immediate. And most of the, you know, on occasion in presentations like this, we might talk about certain locations, but for the most part, the data that we would share publicly wouldn't be tied to locations, or there would be, I think, up to like a 3-year delay on the camera trap data being opened.
Thank you, that's wise. We're starting to have some people share their personal experiences of watching the wildlife patterns change in their neighborhood. Somebody's been watching them in Agneston for 40 years, so you should be one of their carnivore spotters for certain.
Yeah, I think the one other question I saw we haven't gotten to was about Mark mentioned the scent lure that we use for the camera traps. And basically that scent lure, it doesn't draw animals in from a far distance. It just, if there is an animal in that general area, it brings the animal to where the camera is. So, but thanks for that question. A lot of people often have that question.
It's a little bit of a quiet spot. I wanted to say, how is the camera rigged?
Or triggered.
Triggered, sorry.
It's motion sensitive, so it's kind of like a motion sensitive light that you might have outside your house.
If you wanted to set up a camera in your backyard, are they accessible to the public market and you could do your own monitoring of your children or your cat or your wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. You can get them for as cheap as about $100. Now you kind of get what you pay for with camera traps, and the higher end ones are up around $500 or $600. But within that range, you can definitely, all sorts of stores have them. And in fact, if there are any hunters here, you might already be familiar with these because a lot of them use them for kind of scoping out game trails and such right before hunting season. So that's usually where they're marketed. That's the main sort of non-research market, is for hunters.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Did you expect 15 years ago in your lives that you would be monitoring urban carnivores and using the public to help you do community science and using camera traps? Or is this a route in your career that is surprising to either of you?
I can start. I feel like it's a pleasant surprise. It is definitely a surprise. That's a great question. Because 15 years ago, where was I? I think I was just wrapping up grad school, and I was studying fishers in the Southern Sierra just south of Yosemite. So it was very much, wild critters and wild spaces. But when I started at Seattle U is right in the middle of kind of Capitol Hill and First Hill, very urban. And I thought that I wanted projects that would be easily accessible for my students, that you could, hop on a bike or the bus to go check your camera traps if you needed. So that really was what pushed me in the direction of urban ecology, and really wanting to do more place-based research around the place where I was actually living, as opposed to sort of working in one place but then going somewhere else to do my fieldwork.
Yeah, and I think that's, from the perspective of Woodland Park Zoo, I think that, a similar kind of interest has driven some of our urban involvement in urban research. And for me personally, I've worked mostly with audiences across Washington, but mostly in King County, and so it's kind of a natural for me. One of the first projects like this I was involved with started about 10 years ago with Woodland Park Zoo with our amphibian monitoring project. And so that got me really interested in how, a broad community of people can get involved in conservation, and that there's really so many questions still about urban wildlife that we have yet to answer. So we need all that data.
True, and I know one of the things that we've been observing at Audubon in different cities and places around the country is because of the stay-at-home expectations and everyone's living more close in, there are more people who are actually paying a little bit of attention to wildlife, and they might be seeing the birds fly by outside their apartment window, or they might be enjoying whatever comes by in their little backyard, or just on their walks in the street. And so there seems to be a resurgence of people's paying attention to the animals that they're actually sharing their habitat and their neighborhood with. So there's a couple of specific questions. One was, can you remind us what's the name of the website where you can tag your photos? I can't get my screen to scroll. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I just typed into that one. It's called zooniverse.org, and then there's kind of a longer URL there. But you can also, if you go to zoo.org/community science, we have the link right there as well.
So there's a request that people ask you what's your most exciting urban wildlife sighting, but I would suggest that we let this be crowdsourced and have everybody think for a moment, what's your most excited urban wildlife sighting, and have everybody type it in, and we'll get a whole scroll and just see what are cool critters that people have seen in urban sightings, and then we will thank our lovely speakers for such an exciting program. So what's your answers? You can, okay, we need typing in, we need crowd participation here.
I'm thinking about mine. It's actually, it's a little more prosaic than maybe you might think. It was seeing a deer on Beacon Hill in a camera trap that was right at the point where the West Seattle Bridge, rest in peace, meets up with I-5. And so there's that green space right in that corner whereas you're coming down Columbian, and then you can get onto I-5. And right in that green space there, I saw a deer, and then on a camera trap, and then in person I saw a deer, maybe the same one, actually just a little further north near the Holgate Bridge in that same green belt. And it was just, it was so close to the freeway, my student and I couldn't hear each other talk. But there's a deer right there eating plums from an old, it was an old orchard. So that was pretty exciting.
That's
Katie,
cool.
You want to fess up?
Yeah, so many. One that was on camera traps recently, and this was out in Issaquah. There was a deer kind of walking cautiously across in front of the camera. You could tell it was very cautious. Its tail was straight up. And then all of a sudden you see these eyes, and it was a bobcat. And so the deer and the bobcat apparently just kind of looked at each other, and then each went their separate ways. And that was really interesting to see.
That sounds fun.
Actually, my favorite one is one that hasn't happened yet. I really want to see a bobcat, and I'm like, I just got to go hang out in Issaquah because there's seems like so many reports of them from out that way. I just need to like camp in someone's yard and hope to see a bobcat. But
sit right next to their ring.
Exactly.
So we're running up against a time clock. I hope other people could read the chat, but we have beaver, raccoons, possums, otters, Lewis's woodpeckers, possums, raccoons. People wish to see flying squirrels, black bears, red foxes, river otters. Clearly, we have a lot of wildlife observers here. I want to please everyone join me in thanking Katie and Mark for giving us a wonderful presentation and for your work, both studying the wildlife in our urban areas and engaging the community and participating in that work. Please join me in thanking Joey Manson, our Center Director, for making this program and these other programs possible. We're grateful, Joey. And thanks to all of you for spending your evening with us. We hope you enjoyed the program. We have another online event on Thursday, September the 3rd. It's going to be a presentation about Seattle's tree canopy and measures we can take to grow and protect this resource. And we will have as our special host that evening, Seattle Times award-winning writer Linda Mapes. If you want to rewatch any of this program, or if you have a friend who missed it and you think would enjoy it, you'll be able to see it for free on the Rewind page at the Seward Park Audubon Center's website. So Katie and Mark, thank you so much for joining us, and best wishes to everyone. Have a great evening.